All right, thanks everybody for coming. So I think most Americans believe you have to live within your means. You find out this is how much money I'm going to make, and this is how much money I get to spend. Might want to buy something else, but you don't do it. When you're in business, you know if you don't balance your budget, eventually the banks, whoever your lender is going to walk away from you. They're going to say, oh, you can't do that anymore. Up here, that doesn't seem to be the case. There's a belief up here that there is no limit what we can spend money on. It doesn't make any sense. As a parent and a grandparent, you don't say, you know what, I'm going to leave a whole bunch of debt to my kids and my grandkids. You would never even think about doing that. And when you look at who's getting impacted the most, just look at over the last 20 years as we've just dramatically increased the spending in this country. The rich are getting richer. Wall Street does really well, okay? And who gets hurt? The poor. Gas prices are up, food prices are up, housing prices are up. Look at somebody getting out of school today and try to buy a house. Look at just the cost of housing in this country. But everything, and it's caused by reckless government spending. Now, if you just look at what's happened since the COVID, anybody have an idea what our population increase has been since 2019, since the pre-COVID year? How many, as a percentage, how many more Americans? The number is 1.8%. So there's a 1.8% increase in the number of people living in the country. But if you go look at the Biden budget, it would be a 55% increase, 55% increase from pre-COVID. There's no chance that we're going to live within our budget, live within our means. You can do it. When I became the governor of Florida, Florida had not lived within its means for 20 straight years. Everybody says, oh, the states have to live within their means. Complete fallacy. Just borrow more money. The state of Florida borrowed an additional $1 billion every year for 20 years. We're going in default on some of our debt. So what we did the first year, we said, this is how much money we're going to collect. This is how much we're going to spend. And guess what? We did it for 8 years. We balanced about shocking. A state balanced our budget. And we actually paid off in 8 years a third of the state debt. We can do the same thing up here. Now, here's what I'm appreciative about the Freedom Caucus. They have put out their ideas, right? And if you think about it, there's two things we have to do. We have to say we're going to make some structural changes because up here, if we don't change, this is never going to get better. I've been up here 4 years. It's getting worse. The deficits are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So two things. One, what they've done is they said, here's some ideas that we can do, and with this, let's have a conversation. On top of it, they said, these are some ways, this is some areas where we can take some money back and save some money. Why don't we have a conversation about that? Who am I disappointed with? Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer. They don't even want to have a conversation. So this is wrong. So I'm very optimistic with what the Freedom Caucus has done. We have a great opportunity to start the process of doing what every family in this country does, businesses do, is living within our means. So now let me turn it over to Scott Perry.
Well, thanks, Senator. And I can't tell you what a great privilege it is to be with my colleagues and colleagues on the Senate side as well that share the same vision for our country, which is prosperity. And I just remind everybody that this most recent round started in December, right? December 23rd, a huge omnibus. A lot of people don't know what an omnibus was, but suffice it to say $1.7 trillion in spending that's generally unaccounted for, printed money or money created out of thin air. And then literally 2 weeks later, Janet Yellen comes out and says, hold on, everybody, we're out of money. Hit the credit card limit. You better fix this. Now, you telling me they didn't know that 2 weeks before? They knew it. They knew they were breaking the bank, but they didn't care. That's simply how it goes. They didn't care. Now, listen, we're not going to default on America's debt. Now, Freedom Caucus members have habitually not voted for debt ceiling increases because we didn't come here to bankrupt the country. But we understand that the Democrats forced this on us, and we've got to deal with it. We've got to govern. And so we want to be part of the solution. And so where we have never voted for something before, we thought it was important to say, you know what? We are part of the solution. Democrats are often critical of Republicans and certainly Freedom Caucus members as they say, not having a plan. Well, we have a plan. The plan is to shrink Washington and to grow America. And we gave them very specifics in the plan just over a Friday ago. But it starts with clawing back money that's already been allocated, so to speak, but hasn't been spent yet. We don't have to spend money that hasn't been spent that's unnecessary. We don't have to act like, oh, well, we can't touch it. We can touch it, and we don't. This is exactly what families do that outrun the money that they make. They just simply stop spending as much, and they don't go out to dinner maybe as much. They curb what they're doing because their situation has changed, and that's where it starts for us. Some specifics that you already know: future top line FY22 for non-defense discretionary. The other thing this all does is allows us to get to where we need to be on our appropriations process to stop the chaos, the literal chaos across the country imposed by Democrats and the Biden administration, to go from crazy to normal, right? The craziness and the chaos on the southern border, still forcing people to get a vaccination to go to work. That's not normal. That's crazy. And then, like I said, we want to shrink Washington and grow America. And finally, with some policies that actually grow America, like the RAINS Act and like reliable domestic energy. Domestic energy and what we can produce at a lower cost and cleaner in America impacts the entire global market. But what it really does is it makes every single purchase that you buy, whether you're wealthy or whether you're poor, it makes it more expensive when the Biden administration makes our energy more expensive and harder to get, and it makes it more difficult on the global market as well. So those are just a couple things. But I do want to address the fact that the president has talked now a couple times about the Freedom Caucus proposal. And he started out with the border, right? Talking about how the Freedom Caucus proposal would harm our efforts to secure our border. Well, that's like a pyromaniac trying to teach you about fire prevention. Like, is he serious? And so obviously I think at some point even the press kind of figured out, and even the Biden administration, that's probably not what we ought to talk about. So then he went to energy. He went right to energy. I'll remind you, President Biden's first act in the White House was to stop the Keystone Pipeline. This is American energy that he stopped. So apparently that didn't look too good to him. So now he's on inflation, saying this is going to cost all Americans more. I'll just remind everybody to a couple years ago, under a different administration, what inflation looked like. We have a solution here, and the solution is to stop the craziness of the Biden administration and get back to normalcy by shrinking Washington and growing America. I would like to now recognize my good friend and your friend, Mike Lee, the senator from Utah. Mike, Senator.
Look, this is tyranny, and we've got to stop it. Out-of-control spending is causing all sorts of problems. For the average Utah family, it's costing about $1,000 a month more every single month just to live, just for basic monthly household expenses, relative to January of 2021. All this has come about as a result of excessive, out-of-control federal spending. And it's not limited to inflation. The inflation that it causes, the other forces set off other dynamics that result in things like the failure of Silicon Valley Bank. Just met with a whole room full of bankers just a couple of hours ago who acknowledged the fact that excessive federal spending resulted in other things that caused other things that resulted in that failure. And, we have to be mindful of that. So this isn't just any ordinary debt ceiling increase. It's a debt ceiling increase that's come after more than 2 years of heavy inflation. Inflation that we were told at first was just short term. It was transitory. It turned out to be rather something not that, quite the opposite of that. This is a longer term problem for us now. It's going to cause all sorts of other problems. We've got to take it down. While we're on that note of any ordinary debt ceiling increase, keep in mind that over the last half century or so, we have raised the debt ceiling a number of times, and at least, I don't know, it's like 35, 40% of those times, there are conditions attached to it. It makes a lot of sense when you do that, just as when you were increasing, I don't know, your credit limit, your borrowing limit as a business, as an individual, as a family. You'd want to have some sort of plan to make sure that you kept it under control. When would be a more appropriate time to do that than now? And yet, all of a sudden, our Democratic leaders are pretending as if this is like apocalyptic stuff. This is Book of Revelation stuff. This is men and women, or dogs and cats living together in the streets. that we attach conditions to this. Of course, not acknowledging the fact that attaching conditions to a debt ceiling hike is not anything new. He then said that what those Republicans are trying to do is to cause a default. This is doubly wrong. Doubly wrong. First, because that is not a default. You can blow past the debt ceiling increase deadline, so to speak, and then it just means the government can't borrow more. Yes, that causes problems. Yes, we'd have to figure out what to cut, what to not cut. But that is not itself a default. It's a situation where we'd have to address something. We're not even suggesting that we do that without raising the debt ceiling. All we're saying is, let's deal with the conditions. Secondly, it's wrong for him to say that they're flirting with the default. They're trying to cause a default because he's the one saying he won't accept any conditions, notwithstanding the fact that conditions have, for a long time, been a norm that we've often resorted to. Not enough, in my opinion, but we have resorted to them. So if what he's really saying is, we will refuse, if he really does believe that not raising it equals default, and if he's really saying he's willing to cause that kind of default as he's now defined it, then he's saying that he's willing to cause a default. I really applaud the people that I'm standing with here on this stage. These members of the House of Representatives who on their own initiative have gone out and done some very difficult work to try to figure out solutions for this moving forward. Among the other things that they've proposed doing, including capping spending levels, identifying areas where cuts need to be made, clawing back certain revenues, they've also addressed the fact that it's helpful to us when looking at our debt ceiling package to look at the revenue side, look at economic growth. What is it that we could do to promote economic growth? One of the greatest things we could do in that area is pass meaningful regulatory reforms like the REINS Act, which is what they've suggested that we do. The reason for that is most of our laws, measured by word length, volume, weight, economic regulatory impact, are not made by elected senators and representatives. No, they're made by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. This results from decades of Democrats and Republicans for both chambers proposing these laws that say we shall have good law in Area X and we hereby give to Agency Y the power to make and interpret and enforce and adjudicate laws. This is tyranny. James Madison said in Federalist 62, it'll be of little benefit to the American people that their laws may be written by men of their own choosing, if those laws be so voluminous and complex they can't reasonably be read and understood by those subject to them. If the people can't even understand what the law is from day to day, we're there now. Last year's Federal Register, 99,000 pages long. Not only are those laws too voluminous, complex, and ever-changing to provide anyone any semblance of fair notice and due process, they are not even written by men and women of our own choosing. I applaud these brave men and women, and I stand with them.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Scott, Senator Lee. It's great to be with you as members of the Freedom Caucus talking about something that is actually an existential crisis. And so let's just consider what the House Freedom Caucus proposal entailed. It entailed wanting to cut wasteful, weaponized, and woke spending programs to get this nation back on track. That's all it was. It's a common sense approach. We sit at $31.4 trillion in national debt today. The Biden budget plan, what they propose is a $20 trillion increase to take us to $50 trillion in national debt by 2033. And over the next 2 years, they want to raise the debt ceiling by almost $4 trillion. That's astronomical. So what did the Freedom Caucus do? They said, well, look, none of us have ever voted for a debt ceiling increase, but we would entertain it. We would consider it if we got some conditions, some things that might actually help the country. How about clawing back the student loan forgiveness plan that not only forgave debts but also restructured others for a total of, as I learned this weekend, $609 billion. $609 billion. How about doing that? How about cutting Biden's invasive IRS army? House has already passed it. We need the Senate to take it up. That's another $80 billion. How about elimination of the wacky, crazy Green New Deal tax credits and subsidies? That's $350 billion. Now you're talking real money. You're talking $1 trillion. And in a nation where we have a structural debt every month, structural deficit every month of $100 billion, you can push out that debt ceiling, necessity of debt ceiling increase by almost a year with some common sense, rational plans. It's real simple. And not only that, we're not proposing anything like I'm filtering here, what our Commander-in-Chief has proposed with regard to the budget. We're not touching Social Security retirement benefits. We're not proposing anything on a reduction in Medicare benefits. And we sure as heck aren't saying let's cut the border security funding. Not like this administration is doing in their budget proposal. We actually will immediately save more than $1 trillion with the cuts and the rescissions that we've proposed. This is the vehicle to get us moving back in the right direction. And in a country where the main driver of inflation is really one thing, and that is the out-of-control federal spending, this is an opportunity to turn back the clock on inflation. And then you throw in the fact that we have an energy policy plan as well, and get our domestic energy production going again, and that will reduce costs of about 40%. Because you know who's getting hammered the most? It isn't the White House. It's not the folks that live in that bubble. It's the American citizen, the men and women who live in this country. And it's time we do something to help them and stop playing games. And I tell you what, if we enact the House Freedom Caucus plan, you don't need to raise that debt ceiling tomorrow. You don't have to raise it in August, because we will start bringing down that monthly structural deficit, which drives the increase in the national debt, which in turn drives your inflation. Let's stop it now. With that, I am pleased to stand with my friends from the Senate, and I will, and the men and women of the House Freedom Caucus, and I'm now pleased to throw it to my good friend from Texas, Mr. Chip Roy.
Thanks, Andy. Well, thank you all for being here. I thank Senators Scott and Lee for joining us here, along with my colleagues at the Freedom Caucus. And but it is great to see my friends. Look, I can't figure out which way the administration wants to have it. You got the director of the Office of Management and Budget who says that our plan wouldn't do anything for deficits or for debt. But then, out of the same mouth, they come out and say, we're cutting everything. Oh my gosh, right? Women and children all across the country are going to be suffering because of what we're cutting. Well, which is it, right? I mean, the truth is what we're doing is trying to address an actual problem, a problem that this administration, and frankly for too long, both sides of the aisle here in this building have refused to actually address, which is a massive spending problem, racking up debt, but more importantly, a spending problem that is empowering bureaucrats to the detriment of the American people. When I go home to Texas, not one person I represent comes up to me and says, will you please give more power to bureaucrats? Will you please give more regulations, give more control to the government to interfere with my life and my well-being? Not one. Not one of them ever comes up to me and says that. But yet, that's precisely what this administration wants to do. Increase taxes, increase regulations, and then say, oh, don't worry, we're reducing the debt over the next decade from 20 trillion to 17 trillion, which frankly isn't even exactly accurate. But they're saying that that's somehow a big win. My question for you guys in the press, do you care about the current state of the dollar, the current state of the country? I mean, are you going to go hold this administration responsible for completely destroying the economic health and the fiscal strength of this country? That's a question. You can hold us accountable too. But everybody goes to their corners and they say, they're cutting Medicare and Social Security. Well, as my friend from Arizona just said, we didn't say anything remotely close to that. We're talking about ensuring that we can protect Social Security retirement benefits and Medicare benefits. But I can tell you who's not. It's my Democratic colleagues who in 8 years will ensure that Medicare and Social Security are completely without funds. Because they don't want to actually address the truth. They don't want to look at the American people and speak the truth. We're going to speak the truth to, frankly, both sides of the aisle. It is time for this country to actually have leadership in this town that wants to change it, to do what we actually said we would do, to actually come forward with a plan to cut spending, to reduce the deficit, to save $3 trillion plus over a decade. No, we're not going to balance the budget on the back of discretionary spending. Everybody knows, everybody can do math. But what we can do is prove to the American people that before we're going to have a conversation about mandatory spending, we're not going to be sending money to pro-prostitution LGBTQ groups in Colombia. Because that's what you're doing with your tax dollars right now, right? You've got the Department of Defense spokesperson standing up at the microphone yesterday talking about how one of their number one foreign policy objectives is advancing LGBTQ. Do you think China gives a rat's rear end about that? While they're building up their Navy and they want to kick our butts? No, they don't. And I can promise you no Texan is going around going, man, I really hope that's your number one foreign policy goal. We're here to actually do the work of the American people. We're put forwarding a budget that would actually cut spending, get us on a step forward to balance, and do so responsibly, undermining the woke, weaponized government that's undermining the American people. Last point I'll make is what Senator Lee talked about, is economic growth. You cannot grow this country if you continue to pass regulations and to subsidize the very things that are undermining economic growth. You can't do it. You can't do it. I was just meeting with a formerly august oil and gas company in my office. Now they come in and the first thing they talk about for 10 minutes is green subsidies. I told them, can you make a single dollar on any of these things without federal subsidies? They all said no. We are destroying the economic strength of this country and our core strength of national security by having strong energy with ridiculous subsidies undermining economic growth. You want 3 and 4% economic growth to balance this budget and to make this country great again? Get rid of the subsidies that are subsidizing unreliable energy and making us second to China. That will actually make this country stronger. And with that, I will yield to the gentlelady from Colorado.
So, as you've heard, the House Freedom Caucus has a plan to tackle our nation's debt and the deficit and avoid a catastrophic default. We are here because of the reckless spending from Democrats who held the gavel in the last Congress and the Congress before that. They spent too much money. And now we are here to say that we're not going to default on our debt. We are going to hold to these obligations. But there are some things that we can do this year. There are things that we could do next year even. I'm all for a balanced budget. I have a balanced budget amendment. But that's talking 10, 15 years down the road. What can we do right now to lower inflation, to make it easier for the lives of American citizens, make it easier on their pocketbooks? We want to limit government, and we want to grow America. That is what this is all about. We have the economic policies that are right to do that. We have the fiscal strength to actually say, no, we don't need these things right now. Joe Biden, he doesn't have a plan. All he has done is lie about us. He has lied about what we've proposed and demanded that he get his way, which is more debt with no cuts and no reforms. That's more suffrage for the American people. They are hurting. And instead he wants to lie and say that Republicans are going to make the southern border unsecure, that Republicans are going to cause an energy crisis. No, Joe, you already did that on day one. When it comes to the serious issues of meeting America's financial obligations, Joe Biden is acting like a child. Mr. President, the House Freedom Caucus, the only caucus who has released a plan to address this situation created by Democrats, meets tonight at 7 p.m. on Capitol Hill. Instead of avoiding the real work of governing by lying about your plan, I suggest you set down the ice cream and come and join us. Let's talk. Let's talk about how we can move forward. And if you do attend, I hope that you bring some teleprompters. We may be able to provide some. But if that is the case, I would prefer they be turned around so we could just read them ourselves. We'll probably get along a lot quicker if we do it that way. But listen, if there's not a specific plan, part of our plan that you don't like, let's talk about it. But enough is enough. Enough of these games where you send your press secretary to do your political spin games. We know she's lying when she opens her mouth. The American people see it. It's time that we move forward to address these real issues. And I'd remind Mr. Biden that America saw what the House Freedom Caucus is made of in January. Lies don't move us. Media coverage doesn't move us. Attack ads don't move us. Policy moves us, benefiting the American people, doing what we said we were going to do, the promises that we made to be leaders, to be principled, to be strong, to uphold the Constitution, to do what is in the American people's best interest. That is what moves the members of the House Freedom Caucus. And if Joe Biden is unwilling to talk about those policies, then when the shutdown comes, it's on him. When moms and dads get laid off and when unemployment doubles and the stock market collapses, remember, Joe Biden sat on his hands while we urged and demanded action. I want to thank the senators for having us here, and I'm proud to be joined by my House Freedom Caucus colleagues. And now I'd like to turn it over to my good friend from Virginia, Bob Good.
Thank you, Congressman Boebert. I also want to extend my thanks to Senator Lee and Senator Scott joining Chairman Perry and hosting this press conference for us here today. I want the American people to know, we want the American people to know that hope and help is on the way. This is not yesteryear's Republican House conference. This is not the Republican Party of the past that will surrender to the failures of the past and do what we've always done. We intend to do what the American people elected us to do, and that is to bring fiscal responsibility, fiscal stability to Washington. As Congressman Boebert said, we made history in January where you had members of the Republican House put their own political interests, their own political careers at risk to do what they thought was best for the conference, to make history in voting against the presumptive leadership of their party because we needed to reform how Congress worked, we needed to reform how the House worked. And you're going to see us make history again. We're freshmen, Congressman Donalds, Congressman Boebert and I, but the veterans who are here today will tell you they have never been able to cut spending since they've been serving in Congress. We've never cut spending on the House side in modern times. We're going to do that. I'm going to have the opportunity tomorrow as part of the Budget Committee to question President Biden's budget director. It's kind of funny that they even have a budget director, but for the spender-in-chief and for his budget director, Young, I want to try to help them a little bit of basic economic fiscal literacy. When you borrow and spend more, it increases the national debt. When you cut spending, it decreases the national debt, and we're going to do the latter. We're going to cut spending and decrease the national debt. $32 trillion in debt right now. $100,000 per American citizen. An inconceivable number, an astronomical amount. $400,000 for a family of four. That's your share of the national debt. Debt to GDP, 125%, hasn't been that high in 80 years since World War II. And what is this president's proposal to respond to that? To pour gasoline on the fiscal fire with a $7 trillion, more than $2,000 or more than $20,000 per American citizen, $7 trillion, to spend more than $20,000 per American citizen in the next year, borrowing and spending, borrowing an additional $6,000 per American citizen. Every time you say a trillion, that's $3,000 per American citizen. We're not going to let that happen. The House Freedom Caucus is committed to leading, to helping the Republican House, which is united on this. The Speaker is united on this. The narrative and the conversation has changed, not to will we cut spending, but how much spending we will cut and how we'll cut that spending. That's the new narrative. The House Freedom Caucus is leading on that. I'm proud to stand here with my colleagues today, and I want to introduce Michael Cloud from Texas.
Thank you, Bob. You know, it's been often said that you can't fix a problem with the same kind of thinking that created it, yet Washington continues to do that on a regular basis. We continue to reward failure with just more spending. Washington will spend billions on a program, find out that it doesn't have the results and maybe even has the opposite results, and, well, the solution is, well, we just must have needed more money. That is the kind of thinking that must be broken here in Washington and what we're working to change. You know, even Secretary Yellen had to admit under oath that she could not say that the Inflation Reduction Act reduced spending. We know that American families are suffering from massive inflation. Why? Because of huge government spending. Yet what does this White House put out? A proposal that increases spending. It's the circular logic that's just crazy and falls apart under any sort of scrutiny. And the chicken little messaging coming from the left is extraordinary. Just, oh, the republic's going to end somehow if we find savings for the American people. And all we're saying really is to go back to pre-COVID spending. Now, most Americans, that's like, well, the pandemic's over. That sounds quite reasonable to me. Only in Washington is that the world's going to end if we go back to just what we were spending just a couple years ago before a massive pandemic hit our country. We can do this. There's a lot of ways we can find to cut. This government has a massive case of mission creep. And we just think, that maybe there's some things we should stop funding. We should stop sending money to the bureaucracy to do bad things. We shouldn't pay them and give them funds to go after parents at school board meetings. We shouldn't pay them to monitor people's and manage people's Twitter accounts. We shouldn't pay them to do many things. While the CDC was missing the mark on COVID, they were also supporting studies for nail salons. And most American people are like, my tax dollars are going to that sort of thing? No, we've got to bring this government back in check. Let's get back to sound fiscal policy. Let's put this government back to good governing. And the absurdity of the Biden administration, I'm from South Texas. Every day, my district is dealing with what's going on at the border. And for him to somehow say that the Freedom Caucus is out there doing anything, we've been out front in the messaging of the fact and bringing the solutions of what needs to be done to fix the crisis at the border that he has all done everything he can to exacerbate. But this is the kind of crazy thinking that comes from the left. They're like, well, we're spending $140 a day per migrant. With inflation, we need to spend $160 a day per migrant. Plus, we might have to plus it up if more people are coming on. This is literally the absurd conversation that they bring to the table. Well, we're like, how about we secure the border? Sounds reasonable. It'll also protect our families. It'll save us. There's a lot of things we can do to bring this government into check, to pull back on the woke and weaponized spending. And before we ask the American people, before we take out another loan using them as collateral for stuff this government wants to do, all we're saying is, hey, let's check under the couch cushions maybe. Let's see if we can find some money that's hanging around somewhere that doesn't need to be spent on maybe some wants, and let's put it towards some actual needs of this federal government. Let's look what we can do to go forward to, again, get back to pre-COVID spending. That'll put us on a strong fiscally responsible path toward what's going on. And, let's do what we can to shrink this government. Let's shrink Washington, and we can grow America, and the American families will be better for it. I would like to invite up my good friend, Dan Bishop from North Carolina.
Thank you, Michael. If you notice, each one of the House Freedom Caucus members here today was part of the 20 on the floor in January. And what we did then is we took the initiative. And if you saw how it was reported in media all across the country, as Joe Scarborough actually was the guy who coined it in an interview I had on MSNBC, which I thought that, kudos to Joe Scarborough. He said it was being catastrophized. And it was a great word. We learned that, oh my gosh, Republican governance is not going to get off the ground. It's going to be a disaster. Democrats are going to run the floor. What will happen if we have a negotiation over the speaker's vote for several days? Well, by the time it was over in 4 days, Kevin McCarthy was speaker, and we also had an agenda that was laid in for the Republican Party, for the House of Representatives, and for the American people. And here's the secret that we're letting you in on today, and why we're over here on the Senate side. And that is that there are courageous United States senators who are ready to take the initiative too. One's right behind me, Rick Scott. Mike Lee has always taken the time to work bicamerally with members across in the other chamber to see to it that we take the initiative on behalf of the American people. That's what we need to do. Now, Joe Biden's the one catastrophizing now, right? Because the last thing he seems to want is taking the initiative to do something new in Washington. The American people are way ahead of us up here. They know that we must get on with doing something new. Frankly, every one of you out there in the media, you know that we must get on to doing something. It must be terribly boring to watch, boring and terrifying at the same time, to watch the same thing happening in Washington every year, wait for the inevitable omnibus with a massive increase in the deficit, more woke and weaponized government, nothing ever changing. And you know we're heading towards some crash site, as Warren Davidson is fond of saying. You know that to be true. Well, the only way that's going to change is if someone takes the initiative. And that's what we've done. Just one example. How much does the censorship laundering complex that the government is running, how much does that cost? It's not just in the Foreign Influence Task Force at the FBI. It's not just in the Department of Homeland Security and CISA. It's not only at the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. How much does all of that cost? It's in the Defense Department. It's in the ODNI and the CIA. It's across the federal enterprise. How much does that cost the American taxpayer to fund the censorship of its people? That's what we're talking about when we say shrink Washington, grow America. Thank you to the senators for inviting us over. And I'm sorry, I'm supposed to introduce Byron Donalds.
Thank you, Dan. Dan, you introduced me a lot, by the way. I noticed that. Thank you, sir. First, I want to thank Senator Scott, Senator Lee for joining us. What you have here are leaders, people committed to getting our country back on track. You know, I say to a lot of constituents, we have a lot of elected officials in politics, a lot. We got one at 1,600, but we don't have a lot of leaders in politics. And what you're seeing up here are men and women who are prepared to lead this country. But what we're not going to do is get into the silly political games of throwing out names and shaming other people's plans. I'll be honest about Joe Biden's budget, which is his plan. It's insane. He wants to spend $7 trillion of money we don't have. As a country, we only raise about $4.6 to $4.8 trillion a year. He wants to spend $7. This is like in anybody who at home, if you make $4,000 a month and you spend $5,000 a month, you got a problem. If Joe Biden was your husband, he would say, honey, I know we only make $4,000 a month, but let's spend $7,000 a month. You know that does not work. Every wife in America would shudder if that was her husband. And what we're doing up here is saying we have to get back to basics when it comes to spending. Spending money back to pre-COVID levels only makes sense because COVID is over. Even Joe Biden has finally admitted to that. So let's get back there. And to our colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, we have to get serious about the fiscal outlook of the country. We cannot just continue to follow CBO baselines as if they are the holy grail for how we spend money in Washington. The Congressional Budget Office works for us. We should be looking at the baseline and saying, what can we live with spending today because we don't have money and our future are the people who are really going to suffer as a result. Last piece, to the press secretary over at the White House who said that our plan is to create a 5-alarm fire, you're lying. I wish you would just take an economics course. Because spending money the way Joe Biden wants to, that is the 5-alarm fire. If Joe Biden truly believes that his border plan, spending more money for this radical asylum process that he has, is only going to make matters better in the country, go ask the mayors of Chicago and New York because they're asking the federal government for money to take care of the migrant problem that Joe Biden has brought to the United States. We have to be serious. We have to be adults. So like Congresswoman Boebert, I invite the president, come on down, man, let's talk. We'll have a very good conversation. And maybe we finally will get somewhere as opposed to this back and forth between the TV cameras. But we got to get serious. We have to lead. So I'm glad for my colleagues here. And I challenge the other members of the House and the Senate, let's just sit down and start going through spreadsheets, guys. Line by line, let's figure it out. That's what families do. That's what the American people want us to do here on Capitol Hill. I yield back.
Ralph, you want to close this out before we go to questions?
Yeah, let me just, to Senator Lee and Senator Scott, thank you for being here. And for all my patriots here, I'm not going to repeat what's been said. Let me just say that what these 20 did, what we did hadn't been done since 1923. We didn't respond to robocalls against us. We didn't respond to the press. We knew what we were doing was right. And folks, I'm reminded, I was on an airplane today and I saw an old Wall Street Journal had a picture of a drowning child. He was coming up, gasping for breath. And that's how America is. We're gasping for breath. I'm tired of hearing of 10-year budgets. I'm tired of hearing a 5-year budget. What Byron said, and so many have said, we're going to present a budget that actually balances within the 10-year time frame. And we're going to be able to see this year this year how spending is going to be cut and how we're going to start the path toward getting on a financial footing. Economic security is national security. The Republicans just got back from a conference in Orlando. It will scare you to death about what China, Russia, and the challenges that we face. And now more than ever, we've got to save this country. We've got to make sure that we're going to survive it. And it's not going to be easy with this administration. When I heard of the Biden budget, it made no difference to me. When he said, you know, a clean debt ceiling with no cuts, that's all I need to hear. But like Byron said, let's talk about it. I'm not sure he's got anything to offer or the cabal that he has running the country. But anyway, we're serious. The 20 are not going anywhere. And I'm just thankful that we've got senators now who are willing to step up and meet the challenge. Because, folks, everybody's feeling it now. You in the media, as Chip says, you know it. Take a look at your pocketbook. What is your pocketbook? Name anybody in this country that has said this has not been affected in a negative way. When you've got dental hygienists calling me like they did the other day that can't buy insulin for their child because of the price of gas, eggs, you name it. Folks, we're on life support. We got to stop it. We got the people around here to do it, and I just want to thank them. Help us do this. You know we're right. We can't continue on this path. And just as each of you are feeling what's going on in this country, let's alert the country, and we're going to have it in black and white so people can see what we're doing, and we're proud of it. Thank you so much, and thank you all for putting this on.
Take some questions. We're on the Senate side, so, ma'am,
If we can stay on, let's talk about the debt
stay on
ceiling.
topic if we can.
Related question on the debt ceiling, but it does sound like Speaker McCarthy is the one who's really taking the lead for Republicans. McConnell seems to be letting him do that with Biden. But after talking to him in Orlando, it sounds like those discussions have sort of come to a standstill. I mean, what's your sense of where McCarthy is in those conversations with the White House? And do you have faith in him to be able to broker a deal that you guys can actually get behind?
Well, we do have faith in him. He's our speaker. But look, the president's the one that said he's looking forward to another meeting. Seems to me the president can schedule the meeting right now. We don't have to wait till this is a crisis. You see, members of the House and Senate working together. We're ready to deal with it, tackle it right now. If they want to put a bill up next week, we're all ready to go. So we shouldn't wait until the last, the 11th hour. And President Biden, he can call a meeting with, I suspect that Speaker McCarthy will go over and talk this out when he's willing to do that. But what I really think he's doing is signaling, I'll have another meeting while doing nothing, hoping it gets to the very end, and then making the crisis even worse, and then trying to pin us into a position that's bad. That's what instead what he's doing.
And by the way, if you look at some of the things they're doing and what they propose is make sure that doesn't happen to us again. We got to stop getting in a position where they can hold us up to force us to pass an omnibus or say, you're going to shut down everything. That's wrong. And so what the Freedom Caucus has proposed is stop this whole process where they hold us up to get more and more and more spending.
Just one follow-up on that. As McCarthy has these meetings, do you guys want to be involved? Do you want the Freedom Caucus to be in the room there, or do you trust that he's going to keep you updated?
Well, look, we're going to be involved anyhow at some point, right? So whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whether you're in the House or the Senate, you represent people back home. And so you have a vote. And so one of the things that we fought for early in January is to make sure that we get rid of the illusion of representative government and actually have representative government. So we're going to be present to vote. We got to see what we're voting on, what the president's asking for, and what we're asking for, and how that comes together. We're ready to go. Sir.
If you all basically get what you want out of the debt limit deal, how high an increase or how long a suspension do you think would be appropriate?
So that's like asking how long a string is. I mean, it depends. If the more you ask for, the more we're going to have to ask for. But what we're actually proposing is actually lowering the debt ceiling requirement by clawing back things that we've allocated money to and not spent. And we think that that's a healthy, reasonable conversation. We'd like to have that. So if we're going to have a real conversation that includes that, the limit can be much lower. And that's something that makes it easier for each one of us to take in and deal with.
But what we ought to be doing is do what every family does. Go through your budget.
Right.
We're not doing budgets up here. This is the craziest thing in the world. When I was governor of Florida, there was 4,000 lines of the budget. We went through every year. We had a written purpose for it. We ought to be doing the same thing up here, but if you have no conversations and you just omnibus crammed down your throat at the last minute, we have no ability to control any spending. We can do this.
I was there when he did it. He's absolutely right.
Sir.
I have a question for Senator
Well, first off, what's causing all these problems is the fact that we're not living within our means. That's causing the problem. It's not that we want to make sure something good happens with the debt ceiling. And the way to do it is we could go example after example. If we went through a budget, why do we have 77,000 empty federal office buildings that we keep funding? If you went through a budget, you would eliminate those every year. We would never get to this point. That's what every family does. You don't just say, well, I just spent like that last year, I'm going to spend it again.
Yes, ma'am.
We've got some budget committee members here. You all laid up some specific ideas, but help us with the process going forward. Are you going to require that House Republicans pass a budget first? Do you expect that to happen?
Well, that process continues, but they're not. Yes, ma'am.
And if the Republicans don't do that, then what? That's sort of the first line of defense is you expect it to be.
Republicans are going to pass a budget. You don't have to worry about that. But the debt ceiling issue still looms, right? And so what we're saying, we've put out a plan early on so that we can address it, so that we can show that we want it to not be a problem and that we can move on to other issues as we should. And we're ready to go right now. That's the message. We have a plan. We're ready to go right now. There's no reason this needs to be a crisis now or needs to be a crisis in the future. If the president wants to solve this, we're all here and we have a plan. If he's got a different plan, let's see it. But look, $7 trillion in spending is that's not going to be acceptable. Now, he's probably going to want something, we're going to want something a little less. He might want something a little more. It has to start with conversation, and the position he's taking generally of I will not negotiate it's unacceptable to the American people. It will not solve the problem. We have a plan. We're ready. Let's get after it. Let's fix it, and let's move on to save our country.